In the history of human structure, the first decade of the Common Era is a masterclass in deception. On the surface, the world's two superpowers, Rome and Han China, looked invincible. They controlled 50% of the human population. They commanded armies that could level mountains. But if you looked at the ledger, the math was already failing. By the year 9 CE, both empires would face a catastrophic structural collapse that redefined the next 1,000 years. One would lose its army in a dark forest. The other would lose its very soul in a quiet palace coup. This is the story of the hidden fractures that shattered the ancient world. To understand why the world broke in the year 9, we have to start with the illusion of the year 1. In Rome, the Emperor Augustus is an old man. He has spent 40 years turning a chaotic republic into a streamlined military machine. The borders seem secure, the economy is booming. But Augustus has a problem that no amount of gold can fix. He has no clear heir. The entire Roman system is built on the charisma of one man. Without a structural mechanism for succession, the empire is just a ticking time bomb. Meanwhile, 4,000 miles to the east, the Han Dynasty is facing the exact same paradox. The emperor is a child. The real power lies with the Empress Dowager and her family. The bureaucracy is paralyzed by factionalism. And in the shadows, a man named Wang Mang is watching. He is not a general. He is a scholar. And he is about to prove that a pen can be far deadlier than a sword. Let's zoom in on the economic engine keeping these giants alive. Between years 1 and 5, the Silk Road is the artery of the world. Roman gold flows east. Chinese silk flows west. But this trade creates a dangerous dependency. Rome is bleeding currency. The Roman elite are addicted to luxury goods they cannot produce. This trade deficit forces Rome to tax its provinces harder. And where do you tax the hardest? The frontiers. This brings us to Germania. The Roman strategy in Germania was simple: civilization through taxation. They didn't just want to conquer the tribes, they wanted to integrate them. They built roads, they established markets. They appointed a governor named Publius Quintilius Varus. Varus was a skilled administrator, but he made a fatal structural error. He treated Germania like a pacified province, not a volatile war zone. He imposed Roman law on tribes that settled disputes with blood feuds. He demanded tribute in gold from people who traded in cattle. This wasn't just oppression, it was a systems failure. Rome misunderstood the local economy, and that misunderstanding created an opening for a man named Arminius. Arminius is a fascinating case study in dual identity. He was a German prince, but he was raised in Rome as a hostage. He spoke Latin. He held Roman military rank. He knew exactly how the Roman legions marched, how they camped, and crucially, how they communicated. While Varus saw a loyal subject, Arminius saw a logistical vulnerability. But before the trap springs in the west, the east begins to crumble. It is the year 6 CE. In China, the boy emperor dies. The succession crisis is immediate. Wang Mang, the scholar official, steps in as regent. But Wang Mang isn't satisfied with being a caretaker. He believes the Han Dynasty has lost the mandate of heaven. This is a critical concept. In the Chinese structural model, legitimacy is tied to cosmic order. Famines, floods, and corruption are signs that the heavens have rejected the ruler. Wang Mang begins a propaganda campaign that would make modern politicians blush. He fabricates omens. he discovers ancient texts that conveniently predict his rise. He is dismantling the dynasty from the inside, using its own laws against it. Back in Rome, the pressure is building. In year 6, a massive revolt breaks out in Illyricum, modern-day Axe Balkans. This is the Great Illyrian Revolt. It is a terrifying wake-up call. It takes 15 legions, more than half the imperial army, to suppress it. Rome is stretched to the breaking point. The treasury is empty. Augustus has to introduce an unpopular inheritance tax just to pay the soldiers. The system is redlining. And just as the smoke clears in the Balkans, Varus marches his 3 legions into the Teutoburg Forest. It is September, year 9 CE. This is the moment the timeline snaps. Varus is leading 20,000 men, soldiers, civilians, and families through a narrow, muddy track. They are strung out over 15 kilometers. They cannot form combat lines. Their structural advantage, discipline, and formation is nullified by the terrain. Arminius strikes. It isn't a battle, it is a demolition. For 3 days, the Germanic tribes dissect the Roman column. They use the Romans' own tactics against them. By the end, 3 entire legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, are erased from history. Varus falls on his own sword. The head of the Roman governor is sent to Rome in a box. When Augustus hears the news, he doesn't rage, he breaks down. He bangs his head against the palace walls, screaming, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions!" Why such despair? Because Augustus knows the math. Rome has lost 10% of its total military capacity in 1 week. The structural limit of the empire has been reached. The dream of a borderless world is dead. But while Rome is losing its border, China is losing its past. In that same year, 9 CE, Wang Mang makes his move. He declares the end of the Han Dynasty. He proclaims the Xin Dynasty, the new dynasty. This is the only time in history a scholar usurped the Chinese throne without a civil war. His first act, radical structural reform. He nationalizes gold. He bans the sale of land. He bans the slave trade. He attempts to reset the entire economy to a utopian ideal from 1,000 years prior. It is a massive experiment in state control. And like all sudden structural shifts, it creates chaos. The currency reforms wipe out the wealth of the nobility. The land reforms infuriate the peasants he tried to help. Wang Mang wanted to save the world with bureaucracy, but he forgot that systems resist change. So, here we stand at the end of the decade, year 10 CE. The map looks different now. In Europe, the Rhine River becomes a hard border. Rome pulls back. They stop trying to conquer Germania. This decision shapes the linguistic and cultural divide of Europe for the next 2,000 years. Latin on one side, Germanic on the other, a structural wall that still exists today. In China, the seeds of disaster are sown.
Wang Mang's reforms are failing. The Yellow River is about to flood, a natural disaster that the people will interpret as the heavens rejecting the usurper. The structural integrity of the Xin dynasty is already cracking. What have we learned from the first 10 years? We learned that stability is often a mirage. We learned that overextension, whether military or bureaucratic, is the killer of empires. Rome tried to export its system too far and got burned. China tried to reboot its system too fast and crashed the program. The years 1 to 10 were not just a prologue. They were the crucible. They taught the ancient world that there are limits to power. And when you cross those limits, the pushback is violent, total, and permanent. But the story doesn't end here. In the next decade, a new Roman emperor will retreat into a paranoid seclusion that will terrify the Senate. And in China, a peasant rebellion known as the Red Eyebrows will rise to paint the mountains with blood. The structural faults have been exposed. Now the earthquake begins. Subscribe to Structural Epoch to watch the collapse unfold. I'll see you in the next decade.